In this video, I will be discussing and performing the suite in F sharp minor attributed to Johann Pachelbel. The suite has 5 movements: Allemande, Courant, Gavotte, Saraband, and Gyque. The suite appeared together with several other suites in a manuscript dated 1683, and Max Seifert included all of those suites in his edition of Pachelbel's keyboard works that was published in 1901 as part of the Denkmäler Deutscher Tonkunst series. The manuscript was unfortunately destroyed during the Second World War. More recently, Pachelbel's authorship has been contested, but since the suite continues to appear as a work by Pachelbel in recordings and online searches, I will also refer to it as a Pachelbel work. Just keep in mind, we don't really know who the composer was. This is a small-scale, intimate work without any significant technical demands, so at first glance, it may seem that there's not that much to it. Indeed, that may very well be one of the reasons it is not particularly well known. However, this also means that it poses its own particular challenges in bringing it to life. And what I would like to do is offer suggestions on how to approach it from an interpretive standpoint. I am mostly going to concentrate on phrasing and articulation, but I'm also going to briefly discuss fingering and how it can aid us in shaping phrases. Finally, I will also talk about my choice of temperament. Incidentally, the harpsichord is now tuned to my favorite Rameau temperament, and during my demonstration, I will explain why I don't think it fits this piece and why I had to choose a different temperament for the recording. Let me begin with a general remark, and that is to resist the temptation of playing everything too fast. As I mentioned before, the piece is not technically challenging, and because at first glance it may seem that not much is going on, one easy way of imparting a sense of excitement is to play at least some of the movements in a more virtuosic manner. To me, that's turning the piece into something that it isn't. What is more challenging, but I also think ultimately far more rewarding, both for the performer as well as the listener, is to look at the numerous minute details and bring them to life through a variety of phrasing and articulation. For my examples, I would like to concentrate on the Allemande, the Gavotte, and the Saraband, but these ideas can also be applied in different ways to the other movements. Let's begin with the Allemand. And what I would like to do first of all is play the first section, and then I'm going to concentrate on particular passages from that section. The other thing I want you to notice here when I play it is how the final chord in C sharp major, which is the dominant of F sharp minor, what it sounds like. It's not going to sound very pretty, and I think it's going to stick out quite a bit. And this is the reason that I don't think the Rameau temperament works for this particular piece. I will talk more about this later, but for now I simply want you to pay attention to that final sonority and how it doesn't really fit with the rest of the piece. So what I would like to do now is to look at some of these passages, and I want to talk mostly about phrasing. I will mention briefly something regarding fingering, and yeah, I hope you notice this, that it doesn't sound particularly pleasant, let's say. So the first thing I would like to say is that if you look at this, and of course you will have a chance to look at the score when I actually play the piece, you will notice that we have a fairly constant stream of 16th notes. And the question is, what can we do with those? How can we bring some of these gestures contained within those 16th notes to life? And what I would say is, one of the things that I try to do is concentrate a little more or hold a little longer the first note of some of those 4 groups of 16th notes. And the other thing is, I do this selectively. In other words, I pay more attention to holding something longer when it is on an important beat. So what happens, for example, at the beginning is this. We have this chord, which we keep for the first 2 beats, and then here's the 3rd beat, 4th beat, and this is now the beginning of the 2nd measure. So to me, the most important thing up to that point is the beginning of the 2nd measure. So what I'm going to do is, yes, on the 4th beat of the 1st measure, I might hold the first note of those 4 16th notes a little longer, but I'm really going to do that a lot more when I get to the 1st beat of the 2nd measure. So in other words, and then since we have an imitation in the left hand, I would do the same thing. The next thing I want to talk about is pretty much where I stopped with this idea. And here I'm going to talk a little bit about fingering and how it can aid us in phrasing. What I'm trying to also do is to think of these gestures as separate events. So a lot of times I don't want to connect what happens in one beat with what happens in the next beat. So what we have in the 3rd measure of the piece in the left hand is this idea. 1st beat, 2nd beat, and then 3rd beat. Now, what is interesting here is this part. The 20th or 21st century tendency would probably be to finger it like this, so that then we go very seamlessly to the F sharp octave. But because this F sharp octave is the beginning of the 3rd beat, I actually use a fingering that may not seem as logical at first. I start with a 2nd finger, and I stop here, and doing this forces me to separate, to articulate between the 2 beats. So these are the types of fingerings. I'm not claiming this is Baroque fingering, by the way. I'm simply trying to say that I'm choosing fingering not based on making my life easier, but based on what I need to do to render these separate gestures. So I choose fingering that helps me do this, because I really don't have any other choice but to articulate between the 2 beats when I do this. The next thing I want to talk about is pretty much where I stopped. What happens next is this. And here in the left hand we have 3 chords. And what I try to do is I try to arpeggiate them, in other words, not play them like block chords, but I do it in different ways. And if you notice during my performance, what I did was to kind of progressively arpeggiate them a little more. But I don't do that before the beat, but rather on the beat, which means that sometimes the chord is going to finish after I have started playing the gesture in the right hand. So let me do it in slow motion, everything with block chords at first. And what I would do now is this. So this way I'm adding variety, but at the same time, I'm not losing track of my beat, of my rhythm, because of course, this is after all a dance piece. So I can do rhythmic freedom, of course, but at the same time, I also want to keep a sense of the beat going. The next thing I want to talk about is a little more complicated, and this has to do with the second section of the piece. So let me play for a moment the entire second section. These are brief pieces anyway. And then I'm going to concentrate on something that I've talked in other videos when it comes to how to phrase the left hand in an Allemande. When we have groups of eighth notes, we usually play the first one long and the second one shorter. So now let me play it first and then I will explain what I'm doing. So I want to look at this part here, and I'm going to play it a little more slowly now. The left hand is playing eighth notes against the 16th notes of the right hand. So we have this kind of duet. And what I would say here is the easy thing to do, especially when we have eighth notes in both voices. The beginning is easy, right? Because all I have to do is and then lift that one. But then we have this. And this is now a very subtle detail, but what I would say is, yes, I do want to articulate the notes, but since it's happening in two voices, the danger here is that if I articulate it this way, it may leave the instrument sounding a little empty. It may sound a little harsh. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do this articulation only in the middle voice. In other words, here. And the other voice I'm going to keep down a little longer. So that the final effect is something like this. So you do hear it, but at the same time, the instrument doesn't stay empty, doesn't remain empty, because there is something else that is still sounding. So we hear the articulation, and at the same time, we're also filling up the space with sound. Now, let me briefly touch upon the Gavotte, and let me play the first section. Is very, very short. So 4 measures, that's it. Now, here again, we do have a constant stream of notes in the right hand. In this case, there are 8th notes, or not 16th notes. But what I would say is that what I did in the Allemand can still apply, but not to the extent that I did it there. I don't have as much time now because this is a faster piece. So what I'm doing, and I'm going to do it in slow motion again, is I'm going to keep the first note down a little more. And the other thing you can do is, if you want to differentiate between the 2 beats, is keep that first note down a little more on the first beat of the measure, a little less on the second beat, and then maybe even play the remainder of the notes in that group a little more detached. So something like that. Moving on to the Saraband, what I want to do here is I want to talk a little bit about phrasing, and again how we can use fingering to edit in our phrasing. And also I want to talk about how I do trills. So let me play once again just the first section of the Saraband, and as always it's a fairly short section. And I do play it on the upper manual in the recording, so I will do the same here. So what I'm doing here in terms of fingering, and there isn't, by the way, one way of doing it. There isn't one correct fingering. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to choose fingering that helps me separate each measure, helps me articulate, have a tiny little space between each measure. So I don't do anything with crossing the thumb under or over or anything like that. But what I do is this. For instance, you could do this. Something like that. I hope you could see what I was doing. I was basically keeping a particular pattern. I kept my hand in a particular shape, and I was just moving it around. I wasn't doing anything with the thumb to aid, to facilitate these passages. I was actually using fingering that forced me to separate, to lift and separate between each of the measures. The other thing I did at the very end, we have these trills. And I added a couple of more. What I would say is that because this is a slightly slower tempo, we do have more time to add a longer trill. So, for example, I could do something like this. And this is perfectly acceptable. But another thing that I would suggest, which I think matches the mood and the character of the piece, is to do a shorter trill, but to slow it down. So, for example, you could do this. Instead of so not, but something like that. And I think this fits the character of the piece quite nicely. And since it's a more relaxed movement, having trills that are also relaxed, I think goes along with the character of the movement. Let me now return back to talking a little more, and I would like to talk about my choice of temperament. It is important to begin by clarifying that I am simply describing my personal approach. Obviously, since we do not know what temperament Pachelbel, or whoever wrote the piece, had in mind, or indeed whether he even had only one particular temperament in mind, the only way to approach this issue is by considering the range of temperaments that would have been available at that time. Even so, however, there is more than one way of looking at this issue. So once again, this is simply how I went about it. And since it's a very complex topic, I'm going to generalize and simplify quite a bit. So, for the purposes of this discussion, we can group the available unequal temperaments into two categories. There are those that emphasize having more pure or close to pure major thirds at the expense of not being able to play in all tonalities. A classic example of such a temperament would be quarter comma meantone. And then there are circulating temperaments, also sometimes referred to as well temperaments, where the emphasis is on a combination of pure and close to pure perfect fifths, with major thirds usually tuned wider than pure, with the aim of making all tonalities playable. However, since particular intervals are not equidistant, meaning, for instance, that we have a combination of pure and usually narrower perfect fifths, each tonality retains an individual character or color. So all tonalities are playable, but they don't all sound the same, as is the case in equal temperament. From our 21st century perspective, circulating temperaments may appear to be more flexible. However, as I have argued in previous videos, composers who were intimately familiar with the characteristics of non-circulating temperaments, in other words, temperaments like quarter comma meantone, where not all tonalities are playable, could selectively venture in those forbidden tonal areas for expressive purposes. Ultimately, there are no better temperaments, and this of course includes our modern standard equal temperament. Every temperament consists of a different set of compromises that reflects different aesthetic viewpoints and preferences. One feature all unequal temperaments tend to share is that the more common tonalities, that is, tonalities whose key signatures have either no accidentals or a few accidentals, are supposed to sound good. It's when we get to the more remote tonalities, that is, tonalities with more accidentals in their key signatures, that the two general categories of temperaments I described diverge. In non-circulating temperaments, these are generally the tonalities that are unplayable, while in circulating temperaments they are of course playable, but even in circulating temperaments, some of these more remote tonalities may still display higher levels of spiciness depending on which circulating temperament we're talking about. Which brings us to Pachelbel's suite in F sharp minor. At least for the 17th century, F sharp minor would have certainly been considered a remote tonality, and indeed there are very few keyboard pieces from that time in that tonality. And if you think, well, F sharp minor is the relative of A major, so there are only 3 sharps involved, how bad can that be? Let me point out and remind you what happened with the Allemande from the Pachelbel suite, where the dominant chord of F sharp minor is C sharp major. And of course, this is where one of the problems is going to be. Now, I did make a video in the past about Louis Couperin's Pavane in F sharp minor, arguing that Louis Couperin may have specifically intended for it to be played in quarter comma meantone as a means of achieving a uniquely heart-wrenching expressive effect. But one way Louis Couperin managed to utilize a tonality that's technically unplayable in quarter comma meantone is by delaying or mostly avoiding the most problematic harmonies and only using them in select moments during the piece. And this indeed includes the dominant of C sharp major. Louis Couperin devises all sorts of ingenious harmonic paths to avoid using the dominant very often. This is definitely not the case with Pachelbel's suite in F sharp minor, where dominant chords appear quite frequently. And while I hadn't even considered using quarter comma meantone, what I discovered was that the remote temperament I normally like to use also did not seem appropriate, as I demonstrated earlier in the video. While the remote is certainly milder than quarter comma meantone in many respects, the C sharp major dominant chords still stuck out in relation to the chords around them in a way I felt was rather distracting. The easiest solution would have probably been to go with a circulating temperament, but I'm not sure that is necessarily the best solution. For one thing, I tend to be a little reluctant to use something as mild as a circulating temperament when we're dealing with mid to late 17th century repertory. It's also important to keep in mind that F sharp minor was not considered a particularly pleasant key in the first place. The French lutenists, for instance, refer to it as le ton de la chèvre. Chèvre means goat, which definitely does not evoke pleasant associations. And such associations persisted during the 18th century, in other words, long after the suite was written. Thus, Johann Pachelbel, writing in 1713, states that, quote, "Although it leads to great distress, F sharp minor nevertheless is more languid and lovesick than lethal. Moreover, it has something abandoned, singular, and misanthropic about it." End quote. And even as late as 1784, Christian Friedrich Daniel Schubart considered it a gloomy key, adding that, quote, "It tugs at passion as a dog biting a dress. Resentment and discontent are its language. It really does not seem to like its own position. Therefore, it languishes ever for the calm of A major or for the triumphant happiness of D major." End quote. Keeping all these factors in mind, my intention was to try to keep as much spice as possible, but without throwing it all onto one harmony, namely the dominant of C sharp minor. My solution was to start with a sixth comma meantone temperament, where major thirds are slightly wider than pure and the whole fifth is not as pronounced, and then tweak it to taste. In this way, the spiciness was spread more evenly among several harmonies, and the dominant of C sharp major, while still distinctive, did not stick out as much from the rest of the harmonies. As always, thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoy the performance.